Hey, it's Josh from Stray Angel Films. So today what I want to talk about is irises. We talked about circles of confusion last time, and I'm definitely going to reference that concept today, but today I'm going to focus on the iris. And your iris is your most important tool when you're shooting video for controlling your exposure. When you're shooting still photography, you have a lot of other options for how to control your exposure. You can increase your ISO, you can get more sensitive film, you can lower your shutter speed, raise your shutter speed, and that will affect your exposure so that, let's say you want to keep your lens at a 2.8, you can almost always compensate with those other, features of the still camera. With video, you really want to keep your shutter speed at about double your frame rate for normal motion, and you want to keep your ISO as low as possible. Yes, you can adjust your ISO between shots slightly, but it's going to give your color correctionist problems matching the shots. You may notice it. If you go any drastic differences in ISO, you'll definitely notice it. But, that's a stylistic choice. Maybe you want that Battlestar Galactica look. If so, crank that ISO all the way up. But most of the time, yes, keep your shutter speed, double your frame rate, and keep your ISO nice and low. And your video will have nice smooth motion, and it'll look nice and crisp. What that leaves you with is your lens and your iris for controlling your exposure. And this is why ND filters are really important. Whereas by doubling your shutter speed, you cut down half the light. You can't do that anymore. So now if you want to cut down half your light, you have to put an ND filter in front of your lens. So if I want to shoot it at 2.8, if I want to keep the lens wide open on a zoom lens, and I've got twice as much light as I need, all I do is slap an ND filter in front of it. Now the proper amount of light is coming through and hitting the lens, and I'm still at a 2.8. Now, that's not what we're here to talk about today. What we're here to talk about is irises and how irises actually work to control your depth of field. So think about your eye. Your eye has the exact same mechanism in it that your camera does. It's got a little sort of muscle that increases and decreases the diameter of your pupil, and that increases and decreases the amount of light that's allowed into your eyes. Your camera has a many-bladed iris. And it's got a little metal blades, and it's a clever little design that allows the blades to actually create a hole near the back of the lens that gets smaller and larger as you change your f-stop on the lens. Now the big difference between these two systems is that your eye is relatively small compared to a camera. On a big Angenieux Optimo, the front element of that glass can be this big. And even on a regular still lens, it's several inches, an inch and a half wide. It's a big lens, a big piece of glass compared to your eye. Your eye is a 1/4 inch across. And it's for this reason that you don't get the same effect on the depth of field with your eye that you do with a camera. So the way to imagine this is you got to think about cones of light. So let's say we have a point source of light, and this point source of light is sending photons in all directions. It's sending photons up, down, and it's also sending some photons directly toward the camera. And then those photons are hitting that lens, and then they're being shot onto the sensor. And because they're all coming directly from that point source of light, they're all in focus. But because that point source of light is sending photons in all different directions, what you have to think about is, rather than just a straight line for that light, think about it as a cone. So the point of the cone, the top of the cone, is that point source of light, and the bottom of the cone, the circle, is the front element of your lens. And then that lens is now refocusing that cone. It's creating another cone where the point of the cone is on your sensor. So if that point source of light is in focus, it's creating a cone, the cone is getting bigger, it's hitting your lens, and then it's getting focused back down again onto a precise point on that sensor, and it's creating a nice, sharp, crisp circle of confusion that's smaller than the resolving power of your camera, as we talked about before, and therefore in focus. Now what happens if that point source of light if you change the focal plane, and that cone of light, rather than getting focused back down onto your sensor, is now the point where it's getting where it becomes a point again, because the top of the cone is now behind the sensor or in front of it. Now, instead of creating a nice sharp point on that sensor, it's going to create a circle of confusion. It's going to create a circle, and that's going to be larger than the circle of confusion of your sensor, and therefore it's going to be out of focus. Now, what does this have to do with the iris? Well, the iris is essentially compressing and expanding that cone. So its most important function, and the reason it was designed, was to control your exposure. But think of the iris as almost shaving off the photons that aren't coming directly from that point source of light, hitting the lens and then hitting the sensor. It's making that cone, which normally starts, gets big and then gets focused back down, it's making that cone into a much smaller cone. And if you stop all the way down to f/22, that iris is tiny, and it's almost like it's not a cone at all. It's almost just like a solid line of photons coming directly from that point of source of light, hitting the lens and then getting focused down. So now, the lens is sort of working the same way. The focus, it's still adjusting the plane of focus, but because that cone is so small, it doesn't really matter. That cone is as small as the circle of confusion for the sensor, and therefore everything is in focus. So I have my little diagram, which you just looked at, but I've also prepared another sort of experiment where I took a 5D, which has great automatic, exposure readings, and the camera can adjust the shutter speed, the aperture, and if you let it, it'll even expose the iris of it'll even, adjust the iris of the lens to compensate for the different light that's coming in and give you the correct exposure. So what I did was I put a CP2 on that 5D, and a CP2 has a clickless aperture, and which means that you can go smoothly between the stops, and it allowed me to rather than putting the follow focus on the focus ring of the lens, I put it on the iris ring. So I was able to make really small incremental changes in that iris. Now, what I did was I opened the iris up all the way, set the camera to automatic, let it choose the correct exposure by adjusting the ISO and the shutter speed. When the iris was all the way open, the camera decided to put the ISO at maybe 100 or very low, and it put the shutter speed at very high. So that was just letting a little bit that was letting the camera was not very sensitive, and it was only exposing the sensor for a short amount of time, and that was compensating for the iris letting in a lot of light. Now, what I did was I clicked off 10 or so frames, and then I adjusted the iris, just closed it just a little tiny bit. I let the camera find its proper ISO and shutter speed for that frame, or for that amount of light coming through, and then I clicked off a few more frames. And I did that, I continued doing that in small incremental changes in the iris, letting the camera adjust, and then until it was all the way closed down. Now, if I take all those frames and I put them on a timeline and I play them back, you see this. And what you're seeing is a visual representation of how the opening and closing the iris affects the depth of field. And as you can see, the iris is coming, the things in the foreground are coming in and out of focus as we close that iris down and open it back up. And then when I overlay my diagram of the cone of light, you can see exactly what's going on with that cone of light. Now, the second lens in is always going to be in focus because I've set that focal plane of the lens to be approximately 18 inches away from the camera or whatever it was. And that's always going to be in focus. But as we compress the cone of light, then the photons that are coming from, say, the wall behind it, rather than creating a cone of light where it hits the lens, creates the big cone, and then gets focused either before or after the sensor and is therefore out of focus, because that cone becomes nice and small, the light coming from that wall is always in focus once I close the iris all the way down. So if we think about the eye again, imagine that much smaller eye. That much smaller eye has a much smaller cone. And the analog to that is a video camera. Your traditional 1/3 inch CCD video camera has a very small sensor and a very small iris correspondingly. So that iris, it's already beginning with a very small cone, right? And so affecting the iris isn't going to change the cone of the size of the cone all that much, and therefore that's why video cameras, that's why your eye, like a small chip video cameras and your eye, don't really change the depth of field all that much as they open and close the iris. Whereas a 5D with a big piece of glass, big sensor, a RED, an Alexa, anything with a Super 35 size chip and a big piece of glass, adjusting the iris is really going to affect the depth of field quite a bit. So I hope that was helpful. As always, feel free to ask if you have any questions. The next one I'm going to do is about focal lengths of lenses and how that affects depth of field. And it's actually kind of surprising. It's a very, but you'll have to stay tuned for that one, and I'll tell you all about it. So thanks for listening. We'll see you next video.